Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast. My name is Joey Schultz and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. First up, he's the guy whose decks probably meet a companion condition just by accident. It's Matt Morgan.
So Joey, signed a lease to move in with the girlfriend, asked her if I could name the Wi-Fi. She was not impressed when I suggested the Sunhome, Fortress of the Legion.
I'm impressed by that. That makes me happy, Matt. I appreciate it.
It didn't fly though. It definitely is whatever our apartment number is.
Yes, a little bit too nerdy, I suppose so. But at the same time, my Wi-Fi is named after Harry Potter stuff, so I appreciate it. Anyway, up next is the guy who would rather build a companion as a commander so that commander can have another companion. That's Dana Roche.
Talking about companions, that first attempt at injecting commander into other formats is off to a bit of a rocky start. But my fingers are crossed that when Core 2021 comes out and they add that new rule where you can actually attack the people in the pair sitting next to you, that would work out much, much better in other formats. So I think second time will be the charm.
Goodness gracious.
Is it the same rule that goes for all the Azorius players out there playing Grand Arbiter?
Yes, yeah. Right.
Oh, okay. Well, that's easy to clean up then.
Goodness gracious, you guys. We have to put Commander into other formats, and we have to put Silverboard into other formats so you can target stuff from other people's games. Your imagination scares me a little bit sometimes, Dana, not going to lie.
Well, thank you.
Anyway, this is the EDHRECast. EDHREC is the best deck building resource on the web for the Commander format, compiling deck lists, data from deck lists all over the internet to provide helpful recommendations for new Commander decks. And what we like to do here on the podcast is give all that data a little more context. Guys, what are we talking about this week?
We're going to talk about the actual data we have about the most popular companions.
That we are. We discussed companions a bit more casually on a previous episode that we were calling the EDHREC Room. Just a pretty casual sort of abstract discussion about companions. But now we have some actual data about it. So that's what we're going to be tackling on this episode. Before we get to it, we have a huge shout out, a huge thank you to the Command Zone, Josh LeQuy and the whole folks over there at the Command Zone podcast. They handle all the post-production work on our podcast. So big thanks to them. And thank you also to our sponsors, Card Kingdom and TCG Player, who provide the up-to-date price information for the card images on EDHREC. If you want to get any of the cards that we talk about on this episode, you can just click the price links on EDHREC and it will take you right to them. We can't recommend them enough. And also, if you do end up using Card Kingdom, you can go to cardkingdom.com/EDHREC and that will help show your support for the show. Awesome stuff there. All right, let's get into this episode because now we've actually got some data about the companions and this is really cool for us. If you want to find this data, follow along, you can find it at EDHREC.com/companions to see the 8 legal companions. If you click on one of those, it will show you the most common commanders that those companions pair with and the most common cards seen in the decks that use them. So this is a really exciting development. We're really happy about that to get some data in to see what people are doing with those companions. But before we get actually into the meat of it, let's recap sort of where we were when we talked about companions on our EDHREC Room episode, when we were being a bit more casual, a bit more abstract discussion about it. Where did we kind of land on companions on that episode, you guys?
I think the main takeaway was we were a little concerned about such a large rule change, and we weren't really sure about the power level. We didn't think in Commander it would be that huge of a deal, but we were pretty worried about how they would wind up working in other formats.
Yeah, that seems to be a good summation of it. Trepidatious, not so much for Commander, but definitely sort of almost an apprehensive terror for how powerful they might be in other formats. And Matt, can you verify whether you think that terror was justified?
For 60-card formats, absolutely. I mean, as the person who tries to play competitive Magic, 60-card formats aren't even recognizable anymore. You're seeing Delver decks playing Luris. You're seeing Bosh all over the place. You're seeing Yorion dominate Standard. So for 60-card formats, they're kind of doing their thing, and you're putting yourself at a disadvantage not playing them 60-card formats. Ooh. In Commander, there's still an interesting deck-building challenge, and I still kind of think that way. They're not all great and maybe not worth the payoff, but it actually is kind of a fun challenge to put yourself up to. But overall, it's still yet to be seen if some of these companions, conditions are worth the payoff.
Indeed, and that's kind of what we want to go into here and see what people are doing with them. When we talked about them on the previous episode, we had ordered the different companions sort of vaguely by what we estimated their popularity might end up being for them as companions. At the top, we had wagered that Jaganatha the Wellspring, this is the 5-color Gruul commander, Companion. I'm probably going to mix that up a couple of times on this episode, Commander and Companion. This is the one that can tap to add Wooburg to your mana pool, but can only use that on non-generic mana costs. And it can be your Companion if your entire deck doesn't have any duplicated mana symbols in it. So you can't have 2 blue mana symbols. You'd have to have like a single blue mana symbol and a white mana symbol or something like that. So that is its Companion cost. We wagered that might be near the top with Kiera, the Orphan Guard. This is the Solez Nia Cat Elemental Nightmare. Can't remember all the creature types on that one. The one that gives your stuff Vigilance if it meets those tribes, which is a pretty interesting one there. And at the bottom, we had recommended that Zirda would recommended. I'm just tripping up all over my words. I can't speak. I do a podcast and it's quality. We had predicted that Zirda the Dawncaller would be near the bottom. This is the Boros one that reduces costs. And we kind of just want to see whether that was accurate and also which commanders these companions are showing up with. So let's get into it. Guys, what is the actual data showing us who is at the top of the companion list?
So far, Kiera the Orphan Guard is the most popular, coming in with 651 decks, and that's a pretty significant amount of decks considering the set has barely been out so far. So it's really impressive to see that. And Kiera is the Solez Nia. Always glad to see Solez Nia showing up at the top. Solez Nia Companion, where the clause is each creature card in your starting deck is either a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or a beast.
Yeah, I mean, and it was a super easy card to add to, particularly that Arabo deck where it's in almost 400 Arabo decks already. But I mean, even if you weren't running a deck that was entirely cats, and Arabo especially encourages you to run cats because Arabo interacts only with cats. But even if you were running that Circurge Elder or Llanowar Elf or something just for ramp, it was pretty easy in that case to replace one of those with a Mana Rock or replace it with, a Rampant Growth or something, and get yourself in a position where you could just run that 8th cat at the start of the game in your hand, essentially. So super easy addition to that deck, and a lot of people have clearly made it.
Yeah. Dana, you put it as the head of your son's Arabo deck, right?
I put it in the deck Arabo, so the commander, I just added it as a companion. I was already running only cats in the deck, so it required no changes at all there. So it's just a free card for me for changing nothing at all.
Yeah, definitely a testament to how easy it is to make that one. Yeah. But there are some other commanders that we're seeing here for Kiera as a companion here. Some that I don't think I necessarily expected. One of them showing up with 43 decks with Kiera as a companion is Gishath's Son's Avatar, so Dinosaur Tribal, which I think I'd kind of expected, but there is a bit of a sacrifice there because there are a lot of humans from Ixalan that care about dinosaurs that Gishath might miss out on. But then the other one that I was a little surprised to see is Hoard of Notions, the 5-color Elemental Tribal deck. That one's showing up with 116 Kiera companion going on there. Like, that's actually a pretty interesting development that I don't think any of us had predicted. So that's kind of cool to see.
Yeah, definitely. If you are running a tribal deck that has one of the tribes mentioned on Kiera, it's probably pretty easy to slot it in. I think unlike other formats where having that free card is just backbreaking, it's maybe not worth making wholesale changes to your deck. But if you can get away with swapping out a couple cards, it's a fun change to make. It's something new to try differently, and it's mostly upside without much downside.
Yeah, and that I think is especially the stuff that we've discovered on our stream. We've been playing some paper EDH just remotely, and we've noticed that trying to actually bend to a companion does require a pretty significant sacrifice, but not for these top ones. And I think just the ease of slotting them in is really what pushes these companions to the top of the list. And that definitely goes for our next one. Hey Matt, what's at the number 2 position for companions?
The number 2 is Jaganatha the Wellspring. So that's the Mana Elk. It's 4 and hybrid Gruul, so a red and a green for a 5/5 that the companion clause has no card in your starting deck has any more than one of the same mana symbol in its mana cost, and then you can tap it to add those 5 Wooburg mana. It's kind of interesting, actually, seeing some of the top decks. Obviously, they're all 5-color, but stuff like the First Sliver and Sliver Overlord, it's interesting because you wouldn't think they would really need the help.
I suppose that's true. Yeah. 159 decks for Jaganatha as the companion. And we've got up in nearly the 30s or so for the First Sliver and Sliver Overlord. Definitely interesting stuff to see there. And I totally agree. I didn't think that Slivers needed any more assistance.
They don't need the assistance, but it was one of those things. I think we actually pointed that out on our Rec Room show that there's just very few Slivers with multiple of the same pip and the casting cost. So again, that's a change that you a lot of times, a couple cards and it's just a free extra 101st card for changing very little in those 2 decks.
Right. The sacrifice is much more on like the supplementary enchantments that you might use, like Lurking Predators or Kindred Discovery, something like that might be more the sacrifice that you'd be making. But having another 8th card in your starting hand that you'll always be able to play something on turn 5 that helps you cast one of those slivers, even if it isn't a sliver itself, that's pretty cool. Yeah. And up behind those 2 slivers, it isn't just those. There's also one more that's showing up, about 16 decks with Jaganatha as a companion, and that's Captain Sisei, which came from the Modern Horizons expansion that can go and find you legendary stuff. So there's another thing that actually also really helps out getting the Captain Sisei engine started, basically. So those are the 3 that we're seeing for Jagantha. First Sliver, Sliver, Overlord, and Captain Sisei are showing up. I gotta admit, though, I'm surprised that Jagantha didn't make the number 1 slot. I expected it to be a lot easier for the 5-color decks to meet this requirement. And I didn't expect that Arabo would outweigh all of the 5-color decks that could pretty easily make this swap, I guess.
I'm actually really surprised that Niv Mizzet Reborn, the 5-color legendary Niv Mizzet, isn't the most popular for Jagantha, because just the deck building challenge goes into Niv Mizzet Reborn is making sure you have lots of different guilds that you're picking up with all your different cards from Niv Mizzet's ability, which naturally lends itself to feeding into Jagantha's ability of needing everything to be a different mana cost. So I figured those 2 would have been a match made in heaven, but I guess I was wrong there.
Yeah, interesting stuff. All right, let's move on to number 3 on the companion list. Dana, what's the next most popular?
Number 3 is Caraga the Macro Sage. I was saying Caraga, that's like a very tugboat sound, right? Like
Caraga.
Yeah, that's what I always assume. And it kind of looks like a giant tugboat, the dinosaur hippo. The condition here is your starting deck contains only cards with a converted mana cost 3 or greater and land cards. And the bonus you get is when Caraga enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with converted mana cost 3 or greater.
Mm-hmm.
I was pretty surprised to see this one as high as it is. I think that feels like a pretty big trade-off, giving up, a lot of your removal spells to be able to just have basically a draw spell on a body in the command zone. But when you look at the top commander, Maelstrom Wanderer, which is probably not running very many of those spells, it's just running bodies that you're going to hope to cascade into. In that case, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. 96 decks for Caraga as a companion, and 42 of them are Maelstrom Wanderer, so definitely taking the cake on most of those. And that definitely points to, like, if you cascade from Maelstrom Wanderer into a Pongify or something, that doesn't feel necessarily as good. If you cascade into a counterspell, that's kind of like, that's awkward. And Caraga, that is a huge sacrifice. If you're not playing Soul Ring, if you're not playing Cyclonic Rift, like those are big sacrifices, but Maelstrom Wanderer definitely seems like the kind of deck that can shrug that off a little bit. Although I will admit, I am surprised that Rune isn't showing up as a popular one for Caraga as well, because that is a commander that really synergizes with the enters the battlefield ability for Caraga. So that's something that I would also expect to see on this page, and we'll see if it starts to creep up along there with Maelstrom Wanderer. I don't think it would ever eclipse Maelstrom Wanderer. That seems like a good home for Caraga. But it is one that I would personally expect to see show up there, because that condition, it feels like Rune would actually be happy and might consider that worthwhile to make that type of sacrifice if it is able to draw that many cards from having this always available to it.
Yeah, I think pre-2019 and just a lot of the cards that kind of been power crept up over the past few years, if people were building their decks the same now as they were in like 2015, for example, when the average CMC, as we saw, back in the day in one of our previous episodes, was significantly higher, Caraga would be much more popular. But because there's so many just efficient ways to do things in Commander now compared to a few years ago, Caraga kind of gets pushed out because of that trend of the average converted mana cost in decks is dropping, just because cards are getting so much more efficient these days.
Yeah, that's a trend that we've definitely observed on previous episodes. When we looked over, we saw that the average CMC was dropping very subtly over many years. We saw that it was dropping like 0.05 by 0.1, stuff like that. We saw that average CMC was dropping. So yeah, there's definitely still room for Caraga, but it would have made a much bigger splash if it had been several years ago. I think that's a great observation.
I think the other cap on Karaga's inclusion index as well is you're in colors, if you're running Caraga, that tend to almost always already have really good access to draw. And it's one of those things where, like, I can totally see the thought process being, well, is it worth making, a dozen or 15 changes to my deck just to have one more draw spell when I can, just run a bunch of draw spells in those slots?
Yeah.
I think that's always going to be.
Caraga, though, once the ability goes on the stack, though, typically it's going to be fairly backbreaking, though. So
you can abuse it for sure in those colors.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to number 4. Now, this one really surprised me to be showing up in the number 4 slot. I expected this one near the bottom. That's Umori the Collector. This is the 4-mana legendary ooze. It is a 4/5. Its companion cost is that each non-land card in your starting deck has to share a card type, so they have to all be artifacts or all be enchantments or something like that. Or most likely is all be creatures, because remember, your commander does have to meet the companion requirement. And as Umori the Collector enters the battlefield, you choose a card type. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. So this definitely seems to be an oops all creatures type of deal. You could do like Lord Windgrace, all planeswalkers, or for Rika, all enchantments, but what we're actually seeing for Umori definitely is on the creature side, and we actually see the slivers reappear here. We've got 80 decks for Umori as a companion. 12 of them belong to the first sliver. 7 are for Sliver Hive Lord. So again, we've got the slivers there, making them just a smidgen cheaper, which really surprised me. And taking a bit of a left turn from slivers, about 6 of these decks are also for Kethis the Hidden Hand, the Abzan legendary guy. So also can reduce the cost of your legendary stuff for Kethis and for Umori, which is actually pretty neat synergy. But the deck building cost on this companion, I expected to be so great that most people wouldn't want to touch it, but it's showing up at number 4, and we've got some definitely creature-centric lists that are showing up among its top commander companion. See, I keep mixing it up. Its top commanders. What do you guys make of this?
Well, one real anecdotal observation I have here is Umori's the companion that almost every person I've heard talking about building the deck has talked about building a brand new deck with it. I've never heard anybody say, oh, I want to build a cat deck just to run Kiera. But I've heard a ton of people talk about, oh, well, it's okay, if I build a brand new deck with Umori, I can run all planeswalkers or all creatures, or so if I try this, I can do this. So that seems to be the companion that people are building a deck from scratch, intentionally trying to do something experimental.
Yeah, I've seen a few decks, and this is 60-card formats, but they're building Pioneer decks, and they're building historic decks with artifacts using Umori, and you're playing a bunch of artifact creatures like Steel Overseer just to make the team abnormally huge. So it's gotten some brews going. I have seen that too, Dana, where people are building some interesting decks, and it's kind of fun to see. I don't know if there's a good Golgari plus another commander, or another color, I should say, commander, to put Umori into a black-green commander deck, but we'll see if that ever surfaces.
Yeah, it's just kind of an interesting relationship for me to see Umori, which gets rid of generic mana costs, shows up for slivers, but then so does Jaganatha, which only pays for non-generic mana costs. So that's just kind of a fun thing to see. And I think generally, if I am playing slivers, Jaganatha would be a bit more appealing to me. So I wonder if Umori's sliver popularity will continue, or if those two companions, goodness, I keep doing that. If those two companions will sort of fight against each other in that realm. That'd be kind of interesting to sort of see there. All right, before we get to the next 4 companions, let's take a quick break for Challenge the Stats. There's a lot of data here on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with it. Sometimes we think that cards are seeing too much play or too little play, so we like to challenge those stats here. Dana, how about you start us off this week? What is your challenge?
My challenge is a old card, an enchantment, Anna Sanctuary, or Anna Sanctuary perhaps, 2 and a green. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a blue or a black permanent, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If you control a blue permanent and a black permanent, that creature gets +5/+5 until end of turn instead. Anna Sanctuary is currently in 48 decks, but it just so happens we just got the Khazir Ukima pair. Ukima alone meets both the qualifications. It's a blue permanent and a black permanent. So as long as Ukima's in play, it gets +5/+5 from Anna Sanctuary. And it just natively has unblockable. And when it leaves a battlefield, it deals damage equal to its power to someone. It's just a perfect card and a perfect commander. And it absolutely is a card you should consider running in that deck for sure.
I love Dana's ability to find cards that no one has ever heard of for 20 years and to tell you to play them. Just like every time that Dana plays a card, I would have to reach over the table and say, "I'm sorry, what is this? I don't recall this card." You always find such weird, obscure gems. I totally love it, Dana.
And that's an additional reason to run it, so you can show off and be like, "I found this. I got this."
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'll move on to my challenge now. I'm going to be looking at Graven Predator Captain. He's the really cool Rakdos commander that can sacrifice your creatures, draws you cards equal to their power, and then you lose life, but he turns life loss into even more of his own power. Really, really heavy-hitting deck here. I've really enjoyed playing with my Graven deck. And a card that I think shows up a bit too high for Graven is the card Lightning Skelemental. This one also came from Modern Horizons. It is black, red for a 6/1 elemental skeleton with trample and haste. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards 2 cards. And of course, you sacrifice it at the beginning of the end step. So it's sort of a variation on Ball Lightning. And I actually haven't had a lot of success with Ball Lightning style effects in my Graven deck, because generally what I need to do is have Graven out and then play a creature and then attack with Graven. And that usually takes a different style of process. Like I can also maybe I'll play a creature and then I can Graven out with haste and then I'll be able to attack. But just the sequencing on that is really awkward, and having the flexibility there to choose when the creature will be in play, if it can be before Graven or after Graven, it just seems to really, really help out a lot more, as opposed to a creature that is definitely going to sacrifice itself the turn that I play it. I'm not usually able to get both Graven and Lightning Skelemental played in the first turn. I don't know, 59% of Graven decks are playing it so far, and while it is a cool looking card, I think that there are other more permanent creature options that Graven could sacrifice that would probably suit him a little bit better. A thing that I personally like doing, for example, is using Active Treason effects to take enemy creatures, so I sacrifice their stuff instead of my own. This is a cool creature, but I'm not sure if Graven actually synergizes with it very, very nicely because it does sacrifice itself. So that's just a suggestion that I'm going to throw out there. I think that the Ball Lightning Skelemental effects are a little bit too high for him. Matt, how about your challenge? So
my challenge is going to be for the most popular commander from Theros Beyond Death. That is Siona, Captain of Pyleus. It's the Solez Nia Enchantress commander. Whenever basically the ability that people are kind of keying in on with my challenge is whenever an aura becomes attached to a creature you control, you create a 1/1 white human creature soldier token. Now, you obviously get some card advantage when Siona comes into play. You get to look at the top few cards, grab an aura. But the card that I'm going to challenge here is Mentor of the Meek. Now, we talked about it a couple weeks ago when we talked about the pre-con effect for Commander 20, and people are putting Mentor of the Meek into a lot of decks. I don't necessarily think that Siona is a place for it either. Now, when you're in green-white, you have access to all sorts of Enchantress effects. And when you're playing an Enchantress deck like Siona wants to be playing, you're going to be drawing a lot of cards. You have Setessan Champion, you have Satyr Enchanter, you have Mesa and Viridian Enchantress, you have a plethora of card draw engines that you're going to be able to pull from in those types of decks. Now, Mentor of the Meek is showing up in 18% of Siona decks so far, and I think that number is too high. With all the other options you have to draw cards for free, I think paying 1 to conditionally draw cards is not what you want to be doing in the deck. Now, it's only an 18%, that's not a huge amount, but I do think that is still too many because these types of decks typically don't have too much of a problem drawing cards, even with 1 Enchantress effect on the battlefield. I think it's just not reliable enough for you to want to be playing this in a Siona Captain of Pyleus deck, even though on the surface it does look correct.
Yeah, I mean, having played Solez Nia Enchantress, yeah, I can't imagine wanting to devote a slot to that card when I could just run, assuming I don't have every Enchantress in the deck already, just run an aura that I could bounce to my hand if need be to generate more draw effects.
Yeah, well, and especially when you consider that the card Harmonized, which only costs 1 more mana, that only shows up in 9% of Siona decks so far, and that just seems like a bit more of an efficient way to actually get that engine going. If you draw 3 cards for just 1 straight up value, that's really nice. Yeah, Matt, I totally think that I'm with you. That seems like a clean choice for sure.
Well, thank you, sir.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. All right, guys, let's get back to those companions. We've gone through the top 4. Now we're on to the second half. Dana, who is up next in our companion number 5 slot?
Up next is Yairuda, Doom of Depths.
Yairuda?
Yeah, it's a soft J like yogging, or
I thought it was like
telling someone a yoke.
I thought it was a Boston accent like Yaruda.
Oh, that could be too.
Oh my goodness, you guys.
Gyruda, Doom of Depths, 6 mana, 4 and a hybrid Dimir, 2 of those. For legendary creature Demon Kraken, the companion clause here is your starting deck contains only cards with even converted mana costs. Gyruda is a 6/6, and when Gyruda enters the battlefield, each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. Put a creature card with an even converted mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. And statistically speaking, Gyruda is showing up as a companion in 11 Atreus Oracle of Half-Truths decks and 6 Muldrotha the Gravetide decks.
Not surprised to see those, I think. But Dana, I got to let you know, you actually misread Gyruda, not because of the mispronunciation, but Gyruda, the epithet for Gyruda is actually Gyruda, the card that isn't stopped by Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void somehow.
Yes, yeah, it just magically works around those cards.
All right, so 50 Gyruda companion decks. Atris and Muldrotha, are these the commanders that you guys expected to show up for Gyruda as a companion? I
was expecting both of the Dimir legends, the clone guy, Lazav, him.
Lazav and Lazav, yeah.
Yes, both Lazavs, because they both fulfill Garuda's companion clause, but they both really like cards in the graveyard, especially creature cards. So Garuda feeding into what both versions of Lazav want to do, that's really surprising to me, because I figured that would just be A and B default kind of going together there.
Yeah, I can totally see that. I do think Muldrotha makes a bit of sense to me. Like, you do lose out a lot of stuff if you're not playing cards that have odd CMC, especially because Muldrotha really enjoys one-drop stuff, so you can cast multiple things in a turn. But at the same time, Garuda is the kind of thing that you can bring back multiple times. It has a nice... I don't know, Muldrotha is actually able to abuse the recastability here, sort of in the same way that Caraga can be abused by Rune a little bit. Like, it's nice to have that extra synergy with the card you'll always have access to. I see also here in the notes, one of you guys has written clones upon clones upon clones upon clones.
So that was me. So if you guys have been paying attention to Pioneer at all, there was a Garuda deck roaming around that was just stock full of clone effects, and then all of a sudden it makes just an army of Garudas. So if you're playing a bunch of cards like Spark Double or Progenitor Mimic, all you need to do is just put a Garuda into play somehow, and you mill over 4, you grab a clone because you're playing 30 of them. So those clones enter the battlefield as Garuda, which then mills you 4, gets another clone, which then enters the battlefield as Garuda. You lather, rinse, repeat, and I've seen screenshots of turn 4, and there's an army of 6/6 Demon Krakens on the battlefield because Progenitor Mimic, Spark Double, all of those. So if you are playing Muldrotha the Gravetide, it adds up that why you'd be playing all those different cards with Garuda, because you can make an army very, very quickly with this.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's maybe the thing that folks are doing with Atris too, sort of a nice way to import that sort of strategy into Commander, and playing a lot of clones, which could also, duplicate an Atris if you want to get a little bit of extra card advantage, even though one of the legendary creatures would die. But then you also have extra synergy that you can do with Gyruda to then sort of mill things out, get a lot of extra advantage. That does seem like a fun list to get a lot of clones, a lot of evil twin effects, have a nice place for them. I just sort of looking at all of these companions, it strikes me that these are just good creature cards unto themselves. Which I don't know. I wonder if that's one of the big reasons why they're devastating so many other formats right now, because they really just are good cards in addition to the fact that they're a free 8th card. Like, these are really good as cards in the deck too. It's just really kind of blowing my mind a little bit, I guess, is the politest way that I can say it.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's a good point. Gyruda feels a bit like the older Titan cycle we got back in, 2011 or something, where yes, it's conceivable that you whiff on that ETB trigger, but it's a 6/6 body. Like, even if you miss, the downside is still a giant creature in play that's going to cause problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Although there is still a bit of it seems like there's definitely more of a restriction here in Commander than it is for some of the other formats. And, not playing the odd CMC, I do think that is pretty big restriction. Is it as big of a restriction, though, as our next companion showing up in the number 6 spot? This is Bosh the Prey Piercer. There are 38 decks for Bosh as a companion. This is the 5-mana Rakdos Hellion Horror. It is a 3/5 that says that your starting deck contains only cards with odd converted mana cost and land cards. And the ability here is really potent. If a source you control with an odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. 38 decks for Bosh, and the top commander for it so far, only about 9 to its name here. This is Kiera the Merciless, the guy who does damage to your opponents whenever they cast spells. Obosh is going to double that damage. Is this the commander that you expected would be in the top spot for Obosh as a companion, or did you expect a different cast here? What are your guys' thoughts?
It makes sense based on how the card works. The only reason I'm surprised is because EDHREC's a relatively old card you don't see very often. I thought you might see one of the newer Rakdos commanders that deals damage. There's a couple of different options. Who did you recently build, Joey? I forgot his name.
Yeah, Graven Predator Captain. And on our stream, we have been playing around with some of the new stuff from Ikoria, and I did use Obosh as a companion for my Graven deck. It required slicing like half the cards in the list. All of those 2-mana rocks had to then become 3-mana rocks, that kind of thing. I couldn't run Lightning Greaves. I had to run Fervor and other odd CMC haste effects. So it was a pretty big restriction for sure. But man, getting a Dictate of the Twin Gods that only works on your stuff whenever you want it, that is a really big bonus. So I actually would agree with you that, like, doubling Graven's power whenever you want by having just an extra thing there in the command zone. I kind of also expected Graven to show up here, not just Caraga.
Yeah, I think one of them actually that surprises me that isn't higher up there is Judith, the Rakdos legend that pings any target whenever a creature dies. You have stuff like Goblin Bombardment and Judith and all those little effects where you're playing red-black. You're probably sacrificing a lot of creatures anyways. So
I don't think you'd be able to use the Bombardment if you are running Obosh, though.
True, yeah, but any of those types of effects, or just pingers in general, being able to just kind of mow down everything and double all that damage, that adds up pretty quickly. So if you're doubling all of those, it seems like a fairly powerful deck just brainstorming it. But one of the biggest things with a lot of these companions too that I think is kind of interesting is we're looking at all of these companions through the lens of decks that we already have and existing decks. I think companions are going to be a little bit easier to stick into decks when you have them in mind from the start and you're brewing a fresh deck versus trying to adjust an existing deck. It's kind of like the power level conversations that a lot of people have, where it's easier to build a deck with a certain power level in mind than it is to make a deck and then try to power it down or power it up a little bit. Yeah. If you have the companion clause in mind, if you have Obosh or any of these other companions, if you have that clause in mind, it's probably going to be much, much easier to build around that because you're already excluding all the cards. So, there's no emotional attachment to cards that, you might want to be playing or keep playing, I should say. But if you're starting from scratch, that goes away. So I think it's going to be easier moving forward with people starting new decks around these. Like Dana, you mentioned with Umori, you see a lot of people talking about this and wanting to build a new deck with Umori. I think that's going to be the case for a lot of companions.
That's a really great observation. I really, really dig that because personally, I had actually expected Obosh to show up way higher than just the number 6 spot. But I think that that's probably a big reason why it might be showing up a little bit lower. It requires a pretty big overhaul to pre-existing decks, but it does offer something different for the decks going forward from this point. So maybe the numbers could change on this. I would like to see the numbers change on this. I think this is one of the cooler companions personally, even though it does require a big deck building cost. But yeah, Matt, I love that observation. The way that it affects pre-existing decks versus new ones going forward. That's a really beautiful observation. Totally love it.
One thing that's going to hurt Obosh too, I think, is you are in black where you have access to, a gazillion different tutor options. In some other colors, if you're building around your commander, or excuse me, around the companion, Joey, you rubbed off of me. I'm now saying companion for commander.
It's so hard. I'm sorry.
Still.
Like, having it there sitting off to the side where you can get it whenever is pretty important. I think it's less important in black where you have a tutor, and if you want to get that effect at will, you have the option in those colors to run multiple cards that let you at will dig through your deck and go find it. So I think this one is a little bit less valuable in the zone than maybe some other ones are where they're less easy to just get at will.
Yeah, no, that's also a really great observation. And frankly, at the end of the day, if you run Obosh in a deck as opposed to in your companion zone, it's still a really powerful card. It's really good on its own. It says a 3/5, but it actually hits like a 6/5, and it makes your Voltron commander suddenly have double strike out of nowhere without actual, that's really, really powerful for sure. All right, let's move on to our next one, second to last. This is Lurrus. What's the data going on here, Matt?
So Lurrus the Dream Den is the Orzhov companion, where the companion clause is each permanent in your starting deck has converted mana cost 2 or less, which is pretty narrow considering you have to play commanders that cost 2 or less into this deck. There's 15 decks total using Lurrus as a companion, and so far it's 11 Eiley decks and 4 Karlov, Uncle Carl, of the Ghost Council. So not that many at all.
Yeah, and the reward on Luris is pretty interesting. I mean, it's a 3/2 with lifelink, but also the ability to, on each of your turns, cast one permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. That is the kind of thing that, I don't know, back on our Rec Room episode when we were talking about this, I think I'd place this one a little bit higher on the list because I was being subconsciously affected by how much this one is affecting other formats like Vintage or Legacy, which really shouldn't be a metric at all that we use for Commander. Stuff that's really good in the way old formats doesn't tend to have as much of the impact here in Commander because we love our 9-drops. But like this one has been really popular in a lot of other formats, but it's showing up second to last here. I think definitely because of that restriction that is a very severe restriction, especially just on the Commander front. Eiley shows up with 11 of those decks. A lot of lifelinky stuff that we're seeing on here. I don't know. Like, I guess this is a really obvious correction. Like, oh yeah, of course this one isn't going to be very popular. I don't know. What do you guys think on this one then?
Well, I feel like definitely if there was a caveat in that companion clause that said each permanent card in your starting deck, aside from your commander, has to have a converted mana cost 2 or less.
Yeah.
Therefore, allowing a whole different spread of commanders you could run. This would be in a lot more decks. I think that is the primary driver of the numbers here, is the fact that there's just so few decks. And I think if there was more, you'd definitely see more play. I think you can get around that CMC restriction much easier than you can just dealing with the reality that there's 2 options for your commander.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a power level concern with Luris at all, because that affects, and Dana, like you said in our Rec Room episode, it's going to do some crazy things to 60 card formats. It already has. If you've seen any Legacy results lately, you'll see Luris all over the place. And that's saying a lot that it's getting played in Legacy, but in Commander, the fact that there's only 2 eligible commanders for it to fall under, and then you have to follow through with the rest of the deck building constriction for that.
Right.
It's not really surprising because then basically Luris is only eligible in a subsection of a subsection of all decks, and that's pretty narrow.
Yeah, I think it is kind of interesting. Like, I constantly misread Luris because it does only apply to your permanents and not to your spells like your sorceries or your instants or something like that. But that is still a very hefty restriction just on the commander front. That really restricts its numbers for sure. But it doesn't restrict it enough to be dead last. We've got one more companion here. Matt, who's that? Who's in dead last place?
So Zirda, the Dawnbreaker, the Boros companion, is in last place. The companion clauses each permanent card in your starting deck has an activated ability. And then once Zirda is in play, abilities you activate that aren't mana abilities cost 2 mana less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana that is in that cost to less than 1 mana. So this has all sorts of combo potential in Basalt Monolith and all those different pay mana to untap effects. It's pretty crazy, but only 11 decks total that are using Zirda as the companion, which is kind of an interesting point. I thought it would be a little bit higher.
Yeah, I think I actually, I don't know, when we were ordering these, I had actually put Zirda last, but mostly because I wanted to talk about it as a commander as opposed to as a companion. But we actually have so little data on Zirda so far that there aren't even any top commanders showing up on its companion page. Looking through the cards that are paired with Zirda most often, we do see some cards like Fabero Elder, for example, and Birds of Paradise, which I think can lead us to conclude that folks are using Zirda with Zakama to reduce the cost of Zakama's activated abilities. We also see a lot of artifacts. You mentioned the monoliths. There's also stuff like Isochron Scepter and a lot of blue and black cards, such as tutors or counter spells, dramatic reversal, things like that. So that I think can also allow us to conclude that Brea is also another commander that's using Zirda as a companion. It is really, really low, though. I don't know. I think that this is sort of an important time to compare the decks here as a companion to how it compares as a commander. Because when we start looking at these as commanders instead of as companions, the script kind of flips. Zirda is actually in the number 1 spot. It has 94 decks to its name as a commander instead of as a companion. And looking at the bottom of the list, we see Kiera with only 1 deck as a commander. So they sort of have the inverse effects when you start looking at it. There's a sort of an inverse relationship to them as companions versus as commanders, which I think is to be expected, but is still kind of rewarding to see.
Well, what's interesting too, the Kiera one, I can only assume that's somebody who was in a coma when Arabo came out. Because I don't know why that would be. I mean, unless you're like, obviously there's people that do things for flavor reasons, or maybe they like the art or whatever. But like, it's just going to be a worse commander than Arabo every single time.
Well, I think it would be for other types of decks, like if you want to do a beast tribal for one of the other
Sure,
things.
yeah, that makes sense. That's a good point.
Yeah, that kind of deal. I don't know. I also kind of want to do my homework a little bit and see whether the predictions that we had on that Rec Room episode were right in terms of the popularity order for companions. And I think generally on the extremes, like the bookends were sort of correct. We did have Zirda in the final slot, and that ended up being true. And we had Jagantha and Kiera as our number 1 and number 2, and those were actually flipped. It was Kiera at number 1 and then Jagantha as number 2. So those we got right, but everything else in the middle was really, really scrambled. You know, Caraga ended up being number 3, and we had expected that it might be number 4. I had put that Bosh would be the number 3 companion, and that's like, you know, third from the bottom. So, you know, everything in the middle is kind of scrambled, but on the extremes, we're definitely seeing the same stuff there. The rest is just a little bit scrambly, I think.
Yeah, and again, we have a fairly limited data set at this point too. So like when we're talking about scrambled, we're talking about a difference of, you know, 3 or 4 decks sometimes. So it's a pretty small differential so far, at least.
Yeah, so that just makes me want to ask then, what do you guys expect from these going forward as we collect more data? Do you expect these numbers to remain the same? Do you think that there will be shifts, some dramatic shakeups in terms of companions? I don't know. What do you expect from these going forward? How do you think the data will shape up from this point forward?
I think Matt's right about people building new decks with them more often than they are retrofitting decks. I think everyone's kind of done their retrofitting thing probably already, and then maybe we'll see that for the next few weeks. But I think from that point moving forward, it's going to by far be people building brand new decks, either with them as companions or as the commander. So I think we've kind of seen the retrofitting phase probably already finished, just because you have the deck there. It's a relatively easy thing to just make those changes. So the fact that we're looking at people probably building new decks with these as companions is going to be interesting to see how much that shakes up the numbers, because that's a much different thing, like you said, building it from the ground up as a companion than it is trying to change something you already have finished, maybe like the way it currently is.
Well, and I think it's also should be pointed out that most people don't have their hands on the physical cards yet.
Yeah.
It's still fairly early.
Right.
I know there's been a lot of shipping issues with the set. So once people start actually getting their hands on the cards, that's when I think most of the numbers are going to take off. So we've kind of seen a good predictor of what's going to be popular. Obviously, Kiera is going to be probably the most popular just because it has a lot of casual appeal. But across the board, it'll be interesting to see what kind of fleshes out in those middle areas, and if Zirda actually takes off, if Luris finally gets pushed down, because it's really hard for me to wrap my head around Zirda being in last place when there is so much potential to do some crazy things, whereas Luris is so narrow, like we talked about. So once the cards are actually out in the hands of players and people start putting those lists onto any website that we can get the information from, that's when I'll be more interested to see what the data looks like.
Well, that's a good point, because I think it's really easy to know exactly what Kiera is doing. Like, there's nothing complicated in that card when you put it in your cat deck about how it's going to impact your game set. It's just a free anthem you have access to once in a while that gives your stuff vigilance. Even if you don't have that card in hand, you know exactly what it's going to do for your deck, and it's not going to be a surprise once you get it in.
Yeah.
Whereas you might find yourself really pleasantly surprised about how good Luris plays or someone else's Luris plays, and it's going to change what you want to do to your deck to play it once you actually see it in action. Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. I think there's some of these down at the bottom that are impactful in a way that you just need to see it to understand it.
Yep.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. And also, I do kind of think that the retrofitting argument that you guys have sort of coalesced on there, I think that will affect the predictions that I'd made going forward. I still kind of personally expect that Jagantha might eclipse Arabo, because I think it is actually really easy
Kiera,
to make
you mean,
5
not
color
Arabo?
decks. Yeah, I've been mixing up so many.
You're not
things
just
this episode.
getting the word. It's not just commander versus companion. It's just getting the commander proper itself. Yeah.
Oh man, I am sorry. I am stumbling all over my words. Yes, I expect that Jagantha will be an easy companion to include in other 5 color decks going forward, and that might eventually eclipse Kiera plus Arabo in the future, because that is sort of a really big upfront surge, but it's the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily have as much staying power as the 5 color deck popularity might have. Yeah, it will definitely be interesting to see how that shapes up going forward for sure. All right, so here's one final question for you guys. I know that we've made a couple of small modifications. I tried out Bosh with Graven. Dana, you've put the Kiera into the Arabo deck that your son plays. I'm trying not to mix up those cards really hard. Are there any other companions that you would be personally interested in trying out for yourselves, though? Do you think that this is a deck building exercise that is worth it to you, or that it's really too much of a task? What are your final thoughts on companions in Commander?
I like them. The more we've sat on them and the more I thought about, I didn't like them at first. Like when they were first spoiled, I thought it felt clunky. As the weeks have gone on, I've kind of came around a little more and more in Companion. As it's gotten more horrifying in every other format for some reason, I've turned the corner a little bit in Commander. I have no plans to add anything specifically, but I do find them all to be kind of interesting, and it's the situation where I think any deck I build forward, I'm at least going to give them a look and see, okay, is this a reasonable inclusion that I can add to my deck in a way that makes sense, that isn't going to handicap me too much? So I think they're kind of cool, and I'm glad to see them in Commander. At the very least.
Yeah, it does sort of feel like they were balanced for our format.
Yes.
Maybe not so much for some of the others, though.
Yeah, I've been playing a lot of Arena lately, and I've been playing the Bosh sacrifice deck, and it's a lot of fun, but I don't know if overall they're necessarily healthy. So that'll be interesting to see how they pan out in 60-card formats. For Commander, though, it kind of goes back to the old saying of, restrictions breed creativity. And this is just another way to put restrictions on your decks and make sure they're still doing well. And in that aspect, I still do like them. Just keeping in mind, is the payoff worth that deck building restriction? Like you guys have pointed out a couple times. I think it just kind of depends on the player. And it's fun. It's a fun thing to do to add to your deck building experience.
Yeah, for me, I think the lesson that I want to take away from them is how it really does change a deck, at least in terms of the ones that you retrofit. Like I said, I tried out Bosh, which really required slicing a lot of the stuff from my Graven list. And one of the strengths of Graven for me was how fast he is. I have a lot of 2-mana rocks that are able to make him just pump out, start swinging, and just commander damage people right from the get-go. And when you're not able to play as many, like such a high density of those very quick mana rocks, it really slowed the deck down. But having an additional companion there that could come out and start doubling damage and that hits really powerfully all on its own provided the deck with a different degree of consistency, even though it was slower. And that's a really interesting thing to observe. Actually sort of thinking back on it now, looking at Bosh as a companion for a Caravec deck makes a lot of sense too, because there's a great relationship happening there between a card to cast on the 5 slot and a card to cast at the number 7 slot, because Caravec's very, very expensive to actually play. So having something else out there that can be a guaranteed play before Caravec even enters the battlefield can also be really useful. So not just observing the relationship between companions that synergize nicely with the deck strategy, but also just the relationship with your commander on the mana curve can also be a really interesting thing to see, to provide your deck with extra consistency if it might be lacking in other areas, and seeing whether that consistency is worth the deck building sacrifice as well.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to call this episode to a close. Guys, this was a whole bunch of fun. These companions are doing a whole bunch of stuff, so it'll be interesting to see how that data shapes up going forward. I'd like to thank you guys so much for joining me. And if any of our listeners would like to get in touch with us, where can they find you all? Matt?
So you can find me on the Twitter at Mathimus55, and you can find the podcast Twitch account at EDHRECast.
And Dana?
You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roche, and you can hear me a couple times a week on my other show, CMDR Central.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter. You can find the cast at EDHRECast on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you have a question, a keen insight to EDHREC's data, or maybe a challenge to stats pick that you think we ought to know about, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks again to Josh Lequai and the whole team at the Command Zone for handling the post-production work on the podcast. And of course to our sponsors, TCG Player and CardKingdom.com, who provide the up-to-date card price information right there on EDHREC. If you want to pick up any of the cards that we've talked about, you can click on the links right there on the cards on EDHREC. And if you buy from Card Kingdom, you can also visit cardkingdom.com/EDHREC to get those awesome cards and help support the show. Listeners, we would really love to know what you think of companions. Are there any decks that you're going to be building with these companions? Do you think that they're better as companions or as commanders? We would love to know your thoughts. And until next week, we'll be back at you with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.